This is Mr. McIntosh with our week 5 assignments. So I'm going to recap week four's assignments and then just kind of explain what we're doing for this week in regards to English 10. All right, so for week 4, we began our new unit on poetry. So first we had our poetry anticipation guide to kind of get you in the mindset for poetry, get you thinking about poetry. Most of these are pretty opinion-based. One or two to point out, though, poems don't always have to rhyme. I think pretty much everyone got that correct. Regardless, certain types of poems sometimes have, certain rhyme patterns, but every poem doesn't always have to rhyme. Something important to keep in mind during this unit. And line breaks and stanzas. So those are the grammatical, so to speak, components of poetry. Line breaks are the spaces in between stanzas, and stanzas are the sections, the poetic paragraphs, so to speak, of a poem. A lot of different names here, just kind of wanted to see what people's background knowledge was. And then this one was just for my own information here, just to get a sense of how people approach and feel about poetry. So then we looked at a poem about poetry by Billy Collins, the former poet laureate of the United States. I love this poem. I think he makes a really great point about poetry. So basically he is, taking all of these different metaphors to describe how we should be reading poetry, right? We should ask people to treat it like it's a dark room where you're finding the light switch, or like, you're water skiing across the surface of it. And he says, but what people tend to do is tie a poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. So, he's saying that instead of merely enjoying poetry, exploring poetry, appreciating poetry, really what people sometimes do is overanalyze it, right? They beat it to death, so to speak, by trying to figure out its hidden meaning or its secret meaning, and in some cases ruining the poem because of it. So that's what he's saying here about the study or enjoyment of poetry. And then I asked for your response about if you find this to be true, especially in the school setting, and why you think that is. So got a lot of different responses here. This is mostly for my information to kind of get a feel of how people feel about it. But it did look like some people were saying that, yes, in school, sometimes we tend to overanalyze poetry or even literature in general, oftentimes at the expense of its enjoyment. And I think I would have to agree with that too. I mean, really any situation where you're forced to read a poem or a piece of literature or a book can detract from it. I wouldn't say it's always necessarily the case, but right, it can take away some of the enjoyment of it if you weren't the one who chose it. And then lastly, our poetry definitions written by poets T.S. Eliot and E.E. Cummings. And really what Eliot's saying here is that, based on who's reading the poem, you really can come up with a pretty different meaning than what the author intended or how someone else interpreted the poem. And what he's saying is that these interpretations can be equally valid, right? Just because you interpret it differently than how the author intended doesn't mean that your interpretation is wrong. I mean, it could be, it's different, sure, but it could be just as valid because poetry is so subjective, right? And then our definition of a poet, I thought this one was a pretty cool one. Basically, he says it in the first few words here, someone who feels, right? Because poetry is a lot of times emotion-based. Not always, but it tends to have a lot more emotion than just your standard prose or paragraph writing. And that because poetry allows you to feel, or perhaps forces you to feel, that when you do that, when you have that feeling that's not present in other types of writing all the time, that's kind of an expression of who you truly are. So you're not just, writing to analyze or writing to inform, but you're expressing how you feel about something. So then I just wanted to see, how people thought about that. Did you agree with the poetry definition or the poet definition, and why or why not? So yeah, that was basically the items from week 4. Freshmen are doing something pretty similar right now also. And yeah, so week 5 now, you want to begin your notes on some pretty standard poetry terms, which I'll recap next week. Some of those are pretty challenging. And you'll watch a poem and you'll write your own poem. And then you'll paste your answers on the discussion board, or your response on the discussion board about this poem here. The IM poem that you'll be writing is very kind of regimented. It's based on a template, so I find that it's a lot easier for students to write it as their first poem because it's structured and you're basically just filling out the template. There are 2 samples inside of that document and some more specific instructions too. So check that out, and then you can share it once you're finished with me. That's pretty much it for weeks 4 and 5. Recovery assignments are linked up here if you're participating in those. And office hours, same, of course, and email the same. So let me know if you have any questions. Just shoot me an email. And other than that, I will see you next week.